Previously, we learned about static and instance rooms, and we've gone into depth of the differences between them. However, instance rooms allow you to create an isolated room for players that enter your world. But let's say your max player count for your world was set to 100. What happens to that 101st player? Does that player now miss out on the opportunity to play your awesome world? Let's learn all about that today. World instances share very similar principles to instance rooms, but at a world level. And what this means is that when a maximum player count of any particular world is reached, let's say for example we have this first world instance and we have a maximum player count of 100. Once that 100 player count is reached and the 101st player comes in, a new world instance will be created to accommodate this new player. You as a creator cannot create and destroy world instances the way you can with rooms because this is done more automatically. So in that way, it's different from instance rooms, where instance rooms you have full control of the creation and deletion of these instance rooms, but world instances are done more automatically. However, you can move freely between existing world instances though. So as we mentioned, once the capacity is reached, player moves into a separate world instance that is created. After a certain duration of the world quote-unquote preps for expiration and is no longer considered when matching new players into these world instances. After a certain duration, if a certain world is ready to expire, then that world instance will no longer be considered during the calculation for when we place players into world instances. After all players leave a particular world instance, that instance is automatically destroyed. Let's say over time we have a few world instances now, and players have been flowing in and out of those worlds, leaving multiple world instances with open slots. In this case, how does MapleStory Worlds determine which world instances to move new players into? So in the case of multiple world instance openings, the world instance with the highest number of players will be given the highest priority. So the most full room will be considered first before other rooms. So as we saw with instance rooms and sending events, instance worlds can also send events in the same way. So between world instances, we can share events and send events back and forth between these instances. There are certain limitations for these events for both instance rooms and instance worlds. Both of them share the same limitations. And that is that we can have a maximum size of 80 kilobytes of event data per transfer. So when we send an event between one instance room or world to another, we can have a maximum of 80 kilobytes of data going back and forth. There's also a maximum of 1,000 event calls per minute. So when we send an event to each of these rooms, we can only send a maximum of 1,000 event calls in a single minute. Something to note is that when you're sending an event from one instance to another, that's considered a single event call. But when you're sending an event from a single instance to many, that is also considered a single event call. So each of these connections isn't considered a single event. If from all of these instances you were to send an event to a single instance, then each time each instance calls that event to send an event to another world instance, that will be considered a single event call. Okay, with that, let's go back into our maker and take a look at the code for how some of this might work. So the same way that we did for our scene management, let's create another folder. And this time we'll name this World Management. And let's create another logic script for our world management. So we'll name this World Management. Let's save and open this up. So as I mentioned earlier, while you can't create new world instances, you can search for open instances and move between the existing open instances. Again, keeping in mind the note about world expiry, where if a certain duration has passed since the creation of the world instance, then you can no longer transfer into that world instance. So keep that in mind. But among the world instances that are not yet expired, they can be searched for and they can be moved between them. So let's drop our code in here. We're going to first find the open instance. So the world instance service has a get world instance info pages and wait function. So if there are world instances available, then we're going to continue. Otherwise, we're going to return. We're going to create a variable for the world instance info that we find throughout our pages. And if we find one, then we're going to return the world instance information. So we're going to create a new variable for our current page data. And we're going to loop through each of the data inside of this page. And then similar to what we did for our scene management, where we searched for an open instance and we checked if the user count plus the number of users that we want to move into that world instance is less than the room's max capacity, then we're going to allow movement into that room. We're also going to do the same thing here with world instances, where we're going to get the current user count of this world instance, add the users to move, and if that is less than the max user count of that world instance, then we're going to find that world instance and we're going to break out of this loop and then simply return the world information. If it hasn't been found within the current page, we're going to move to the next page and continue this process. If no world instances exist, then of course this function is going to return nil. Next, let's actually warp to that open instance. So we're going to get a table of users. So similar to our other scene management, where we receive a table of users, we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to get a table of strings for our user IDs to pass in. And we are going to get the open instance through find open instance. And if that instance exists, then we're going to warp the users to that world instance. World instance movement is done through teleport service and calling the warp users to world and wait function. So here we're passing in the users, the ID of the world instance that we found from find open instance, and then finally we're going to pass some data over. So we can create some data. Let's say we're moving this user and we want to also pass along the inventory information. So let's say, for example, this particular user has 100 coins in its inventory. We're going to pass that data along through serialization, and we're going to create a string of that data. So this is a data table, and we're going to use util-logic table to string to convert this table into a string. And we're going to serialize that data and pass it along to the warp users to world and wait. Then let's actually utilize this function in our game system. And we're going to use a key binding. So we have our on key down event. So we're listening for the input service. And this is going to be a client-only execution space function. And we're going to check if the pressed key is F1. So if the user pressed F1, then we're going to call the warp to open instance function, and we're going to warp this user into the target world instance. Finally, we're going to create a user enter event, where each time a user enters into this world, this is going to be called whether you're being warped from another instance or not. This is going to be called regardless the first time a user enters into this world. So we're going to grab the user ID and we're going to use teleport service get world record method. So this is going to get the data that we serialized earlier through our world management. So that will be this data here that we passed along as a serialize. And if it exists, then we're going to get the user data. This is going to be a string when it comes in, and we're going to convert it into a table. So here we use table to string, and we're going to deserialize it using string to table of the string data that came in. Then we're going to log out the user data coins. Okay, now this actually cannot be tested in a private world. So the only way to actually test it is to publish your world and test it on a published instance. So I am going to go back to the lobby. And let's go into my existing world. And I've already published this privately, but it does have to be a public world. So we're going to set this to public temporarily. And let's go into the play and go into my world. And we're going to enter into this world. Okay, so we're going to activate the console to verify that this has worked. And we're going to press F1. Sorry, I pressed it multiple times, but we can see that we have found the world instance and it's logging out the world instance for our world. Because we only have one instance, we're not actually teleporting anywhere. So if there were more players and we had exceeded our capacity and there were multiple world instances, then we can teleport to the next world instance if we want. Today we learned all about instance worlds, how they're created, and how to move between them. We've also learned that you can send information between different instance worlds, as well as the limits for various events in MapleStory worlds. Thanks again, and happy creating!